Hi, I'm Colin Sanders and you're listening to the History Books Review, and this review is of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Chapter 25, Part 4, Barbarians on the Rhine. The wide waters of the Rhine separated the rich and peaceful provinces of Gaul from the violent barbarians of Germany, but it was no barrier. The warlike tribes were only prevented from helping themselves to the property of the empire's inhabitants by the Roman army. The frontier was tough to defend, and during the reign of Constantius had become very porous indeed. But the stunning victory Julian had scored at the Battle of Strasbourg had shocked the Germans. The glow of invincibility it conferred allowed him to follow up with some effective diplomacy that ensured the peace he had created would last. The watch on the border was, as a consequence, lighter than usual. Most of the strain was being taken by some auxiliary units from the tribes of the Batavians and the Heruli, who had been settled inside the empire, just over the borders, as the first line of defence. But there was quite a bit else going on with the tribes over the border to keep them sweet, and this included a judicious amount of outright bribery. But on the accession of Valentinian, there was a misjudgment about the appropriate level of the presents that were given to particular chiefs to mark the ascension of a new emperor, and in the winter of 365 a huge force of disgruntled Alemanni swept across the Rhine, overwhelming the Romans' allies and smashing 2 Roman generals sent by Valentinian to turn them back. Valentinian's attention could have been distracted by the rebellion of Procopius against his brother in the east. The story is that he received the news of the 2 threats while in Italy on the same day, and considered marching to the aid of his brother. But he chose to give his attention to Gaul. He marched to Paris and set about training and organising his forces with meticulous care. The officers of the Batavians and the Herulians were held to have exhibited cowardice and were discharged ignominiously. Reading between the lines, this was probably a cover for a reorganisation and the appointment of some more professional soldiers to the key ranks. The rank and file of the Batavians and the Heruli themselves begged to be allowed to go back to war to rebuild their reputations. Or, so we are told. I don't want to sound cynical again, but this sounds like spin to me. Defending their own property would have been motivation enough. Likewise, the story that their previous general had complained that the task of taking on the Alemanni was too difficult sounds like a blame game to divert attention from failings higher up to me. But there certainly was a new general. His name was Jovinus, and he set out with reorganised auxiliaries against a much more numerous enemy. Once the campaign started, discipline and military skill, rather than raw numbers, proved to be decisive. The Alemanni were by now scattered over the several provinces, collecting the loot. Jovinus managed his counterattack skillfully, taking groups of the enemy unawares and then forcing a decisive engagement near Chalons, which inflicted heavy casualties and captured some important prisoners. He then chased the remnants to the Rhine. He returned in triumph to Paris, where Valentinian praised him and made him consul for the year. One of Jovinus's achievements had been to capture some key prisoners, and these were killed, including a king and his successor. This was a sign of weakness on the part of the Romans, or possibly poor judgment, as I'll explain later. That weakness was shown when a new influx of the Alemanni, led by a guy called Rando, captured and looted the undefended city of Mainz. If this city really was undefended, that was a very foolish move on somebody's part. Its key position, where the Main meets the Rhine, not far from where modern Frankfurt is, would have made it a linchpin of the frontier. It's held this strategic significance throughout history whenever there was conflict between France and Germany. As a good example, it was where Patton launched the invasion of Germany in 1945 from, for example. So it was imperative that the Romans recaptured it. It was time for Valentinian himself to take to the field. Rando didn't fancy his chances against such an adversary and retreated without a fight, but with plenty of loot and captives. An insult like this could not go unpunished, and Valentinian launched an attack coordinated with troops from Italy. He pushed deep into Germany, seeking a confrontation with the man who had so effectively thumbed his nose at imperial authority. But operating far from supplies and communications was perilous. Valentinian had a sticky moment when he got detached from the main body of the army. He was surrounded by enemies and only escaped death by plunging down a steep slope, leaving his elaborately decorated helmet behind him, with his cupbearer. Being an emperor was not a cosy job. But while they no doubt enjoyed pinching his gear, the Alemanni had no stomach for a full-scale battle with Valentinian. Rando repeated his previous tactics and avoided conflict, retreating to a high plateau which would be difficult for the Romans to attack. This strong point was located and assaulted on 3 sides by the Romans, who prevailed, inflicting heavy losses on the Alemanni, but also losing many men themselves. Although it was a victory and gave Valentinian the initiative, it was not the ringing victory that Julian had won, against minimal losses and against a confident opponent who had outnumbered him. The Romans were back to human scale again, and while it was no doubt necessary to carry out this campaign, there was a potential downside even to a victory inside enemy territory. The Romans would never be able to hold the frontier against a determined and united attack by the Germans. Their only hope was to sow dissension between the tribes. This was a tactic that had been used since the time of Augustus, and the Romans were good at it. As luck would have it, at that point the 2 biggest tribes, the Alemanni and the Burgundians, were at loggerheads over access to some salt pits, so the Romans had something to work with, but they had to maintain the balance of power between the tribes. This is why the killing of important German prisoners was almost certainly a mistake. It wasn't really a question of humanity, more that alive they would always be available to be used some way or other in keeping the tribes the way the Romans wanted them. Divide and rule is far and away the cheapest solution, but only a fool would rely on it. Valentinian was no fool, and he devoted his attention to fortifying the frontier as far as he could. This obviously cost money, but in Valentinian's mind it was more important than winning short-term popularity with a tax cut. This series of campaigns reveals a lot about Roman Gaul in the 4th century. The Romans were in a weak and vulnerable position. Their biggest problem was lack of manpower, and it was a problem that could not be solved in the short term, and, as we know now, was never going to be solved. They attempted to overcome their lack of sandals on the ground by training, discipline, good tactics and diplomacy, and of course widespread use of fortifications. In all this, strong leadership was the key. We see this in Julian's restoration of the province, and again in Valentinian's effective management of what could have been a major setback. The fate of the empire rested very much on the quality of the man that ended up with the top job. Nobody actually wanted to destroy the empire, not even the barbarians. It was, after all, a handy source of loot, but it could only be preserved by good management of all the frontiers. Poor judgment, or even simple lack of attention at the top, could be risky. There was also the risk of distractions like internal strife within the empire. It also relied on the situation over the borders remaining roughly stable. But the plains beyond Germany stretched all the way to China. Only a few years after the victory of Valentinian against the Alemanni, the first report came back of a new tribe called the Huns. There was no way that Valentinian could have had the slightest idea that these new players were going to change the rules of the game beyond recognition. In any case, the Rhine wasn't the only place that needed his attention. Thanks for listening to this episode of the History Books Review. I'm afraid I've been very short of time lately, and I've had to squeeze them in to all my other things whenever I can, so they've been a bit hurried and a bit less well prepared than usual. I'm trying to keep the frequency up at roughly at least one a fortnight to keep the story going. I'll do my best, and I'll try and keep you informed as how things are going. In the meantime, thanks for listening.